has got a mediocre military that is flagging and failing and getting degraded by the day, and which is in turn degrading the Russian economy. So essentially, what Putin has done is he's wagering the Russian economy in this war, not the army anymore. He's going to throw everything at it.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're joined by Diane Francis, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington. She's editor-at-large with the National Post newspaper and has a best-selling Substack with regular updates on geopolitics, including the war in Ukraine and Putin's Russia. Diane, hello. Welcome back. Great to see you again.
Good to see you.
So we are talking against the backdrop of the first trilateral talks between Ukraine, Russia and the US. I'll ask you a little bit about that in a moment. But President Zelensky has made the statement this week on social media warning of intelligence they have indicating Russia's preparations for another massive strike on Ukraine, discrediting, he says, the current diplomatic talks. The death and the destruction continues. How are your friends, first of all, in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, you know, they're resilient. I mean, they're resolved. As I think I've said before, most Ukrainians would rather be dead than be controlled by Russia. They've been there, they've done that, and they know what they're all about. And of course, now they're showing how sadistic and cruel that they are, and their leader. This is just goes on and on. I talked with a friend recently in Kyiv, and we started our conversation, and the power wound down, and we had to stop after 5 minutes, or she went black on the screen. So this is on and off again, and she's in a neighborhood in Kyiv that hasn't been bombed yet, but the bombs are all around. They're close by, and you just hear them exploding all the time, and it's very off-putting. So a lot of people are now evacuating Kyiv because I think they realize that he really wants to pummel the civilians on purpose to try and demoralize them.
Yeah, and I was hearing only last week that 600,000 people are thought to have left the city, and the Russian strikes are deliberately targeting the energy infrastructure at the worst possible time when the temperatures are below zero. It's a harrowing situation. On the trilateral talks, there is another round expected this weekend. Do you see any changes in the approach of any of the parties involved?
Well, I don't. I don't think that it's up to Ukraine to give up anything unless Russia has stated that it's willing to do some concessioning here. But they're hard line, and they're just bombarding the place constantly, and it just seems to be going nowhere. Their army is suffering even higher casualties because the Ukrainians are definitely going after kills because it's just inching along. And but is that going to create any movement on the part of Putin? I don't think so. The only thing that my friend, whose power's out now and her water's out now, and she's on her way to Warsaw with her cats, says that is going to make the difference is $40 or $30 a barrel oil, and that will starve the money that Putin needs to continue his war.
Yes, right. That brings me onto your Substack that you have recently written, and it's about how the U.S. One of the points you make is the U.S. Treasury Secretary doubling down on his criticism of India in helping Russia flout Western sanctions on Russia's oil exports by refining it and selling it to Europe. The comments were provoked after the EU signed the world's biggest free trade agreement by population with India. How much of a problem is the flouting of sanctions at the moment?
Well, Scott Bessent, who's a more kind of moderate Trump team spokesperson, he's the Treasury Secretary, pointed out something very important. And I think we've talked about it on this show, and I've certainly written about it. And that is, Europe is doing a lousy job too. They're buying gasoline and diesel from India that's made from Russian oil. The Turks are trading in it, and others are. And, this is, as he say, why would you do a free trade deal with a country like India that's laundering oil for itself, for its own profit, but also for Russia? You're actually, fighting against yourself by doing this. And so I think that the Americans may really push hard, and perhaps this may get through Congress, the excessive tariffs on Russian oil that they've been threatening for a long time and haven't done.
We shall watch that with interest. And on the US position in the talks, the Kyiv Independent is reporting that officials leading those talks say the Russians are taking a more pragmatic tone behind closed doors, crucially. But in the very same newspaper, it has a whole list of facts that one senior envoy has got wrong while talking to journalists, including the timeline for the war, not knowing the date of the full-scale invasion, and calling General Budanov the vice president, among other things. Doesn't exactly inspire confidence.
No, not at all. This is an issue. Many Americans at the beginning of the war and the invasion in 2022 wouldn't have been able to locate Ukraine on a map. I hate to say it. But now, of course, everybody knows about it, and the Americans can't stand the Russians, and they still can't stand them. So that's going in favor. But yeah, it's amateur hour. And I think that it seems to boil down to this piece of land in Donbass, which they're slowly inching their way into occupying by military means. But the Ukrainians are drawing the line in the sand there for whatever reason. Now, what has happened, however, as this is dragging on, it looks like the Americans have signed on to some pretty significant security guarantees once this is over. And that, of course, is necessary for Ukraine to even agree to anything at this point.
Yeah, that is the timeline on those security guarantees. There seems to be some confusion and disagreement about that. When would they be offered, and what exactly they would be? How important is it to get this timing, the terms agreed now?
Well, you have to do it before to get them to stop. Otherwise, if you reach agreement, they stop, and then the deal falls apart. They're going to continue again, or they won't stop. I mean, the security guarantees are thorny because we know this went awry the last time with the Budapest Memorandum, and that Britain and the U.S. promised to protect Ukraine if it was invaded by Russia and didn't. And I don't think the Ukrainians are going to take any chances that some kind of flimsy or talkie is behind the guarantees. I think they want something really, really ironclad. And that would include, ideally boots on the ground from NATO countries.
And now the Kremlin seems to have coined this new catchphrase, the Anchorage formula, suggesting that there was some kind of tacit agreement. Again, obviously it would be behind closed doors because there was no public communique of anything of the sort, but made with the US. Apparently, according to the Kremlin, if it isn't true, why doesn't the US just set the record straight?
Well, I think maybe there was an Anchorage agreement, but I don't think it's that significant. It would probably consist of Trump saying, "Okay, Vlad, we're buddies. Hey, let's shake on it. Everything will be okay. Just stop killing people, okay?" That could be the agreement. I mean, it could be as superficial and silly as that. But we don't know, and it doesn't matter. The point is, what are they agreeing to now in public? Now, what Zelensky has done to sort of try and get things going on the agreement side is he has been saying the U.S. can win. In other words, the U.S. can win, and they can win and push Russia out if they want to. They're so powerful. They're this and they're that. That tactic, I think, is designed to remove any excuses on the part of Trump to be pushing harder, and also to fortify his ego. And hey, you've got all the cards, boss. Let's do it. And of course, he hasn't done it. He has not used all the cards, particularly the oil price stuff.
And yet, the Financial Times in London has suggested in an article on Tuesday this week that Europe and Trump and the Trump administration could play and can play complementary roles in attempts to end the war, with the Europeans providing financial and military assistance to keep the Ukrainians in the fight, while the Americans keep the channels open to the Russians and sponsor peace talks. And it cites the Vietnam War as an example as to how long peace talks can take. Is this a reasonable assessment?
Well, I think that's kind of really what's going on now. I mean, Europe's paying the tab to buy the U.S. weapons and armaments. And the U.S. is in charge of these, presiding over these so-called peace talks. And, yeah, I think that's a reasonable idea. But the point is, there's other things going on between Europe and the US on trade, on tariff, people, turf wars, and Trump can turn on a dime. This is the problem. He's very erratic. So I think Zelensky's push is, hey, US, come on, you got the cards. You can do this. This is great. Is maybe going to goad him and some of his supporters into saying, "Yeah, he's right. Enough of this. Let's clamp down." Fingers crossed.
And in Davos, President Zelensky voiced his frustration very publicly in his speech. He rebuked the European leaders for not doing enough to fend off Putin's invasion or provide for their own defense. What did you think when you heard that?
Well, I thought that was music to Trump's ears. He was kind of playing to Trump, but you know what is sincere was sincere. And although it was sort of biting the hand that guards you, uh, finances your army, it needed to be said. And I think it's kind of shaken loose some of the leaders in Europe to grow a backbone a little bit more, hopefully. And Merz is coming out talking very tough about his military and NATO being emboldened and that sort of thing. So we'll have to see.
He also complained of the EU's decision not to use frozen assets to help fund Ukraine, instead to loan 90 billion euros. It's a compromise, but that's exactly the problem, isn't it?
That is the problem, and that's a Putin victory, by the way. If it's just a loan, Putin sued in court for this money. That doesn't matter. But it should have just been confiscated and handed over immediately into a fund to take care of Ukraine, its government as well as its military for a long time, and never to be seen again. And that should have been tough action taken, and that would have hopefully been one of those pressure points, or the threat of that, a pressure point to apply to Putin to get him to finally agree with Ukraine to some kind of ceasefire.
And then the suggestion by the Kremlin that the same frozen assets could be used for membership of Trump's so-called peace board. That money's held in Europe. It's the same old Putin playbook, right?
It's the same old Putin playbook, and even more obnoxiously, he said, that's our money, and we want that to go into rebuilding the territories we've occupied in Ukraine that they destroyed. So they want the money that was intended to rebuild Ukraine to rebuilding their part of Ukraine that they've invaded and kept. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's now more than 5 months since the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, spoke of making Ukraine a steel porcupine, indigestible to Russia. How far do you think they've come?
The Europeans, I have to say, they've come much further than I think we thought than they were. And it's through U.S. pressure and other pressures that they've done. But they still don't have an army. They still don't have a military. And this is into the 5th year of their neighbor being beaten up by the bully who wants to beat them up, and they still don't have a bloody army. So it's a very cumbersome. The European Union is a very cumbersome construct. And it just takes forever, and there's so many other viewpoints inside of it. But they really have to, if they want to be taken seriously and they want to end this problem with Russia, they had better get to building a military much more quickly.
So you want a European army? NATO's not enough.
There has to be army. There has to be an armed force. NATO is a cooperative, and the problem with NATO is that it's unanimity. Hungary sits there canceling and vetoing everything they would want to do. It's just, I think that the European Union itself has to have a navy and an army.
In an article in Foreign Affairs, it suggests that Putin's calculus can only really be changed by Ukraine's military strength, backing it with Western guarantees of resources, plus sustained pressure on the Russian economy. Do you think we're getting any closer to that?
We are getting closer, but how long have the Ukrainians got left? It's horrible. I can't even imagine the number of millions of people that have been wounded or damaged permanently by this war. And what are there, 10 million living abroad, living outside the country? It's a shell of itself. But Russia is reeling. Russia is in trouble. And there is no question about it that thing can't last forever. And it's all predicated on oil exports, which is why Europe also needs to have a marine fleet that confiscates and captures the shadow ships that are taking Russian oil to pay for the war against them down the Baltic and the Black Seas. They have the right to do that, and that is long overdue.
Presumably, you would welcome this announcement that was made in Britain this week that 14 countries have signed this agreement to put pressure on the shadow fleet tankers in the North Sea and the South Baltic.
Put pressure, fine. I would just impound them and take them into port and keep them there indefinitely, well, as long as the war continues. But yes, they're making moves, and there's been a few seizures on the high seas.
Want to get your thoughts on a line in the U.S. National Defense Strategy that's just been published, and it describes Russia as remaining a persistent but manageable threat to NATO's eastern members for the foreseeable future. That assessment, I was talking to someone about it earlier, and they were saying, it doesn't seem to have moved on since the Obama era, and that it's seemingly sort of completely oblivious to the implications of the full-scale invasion of 2022. Do you see it that way as well?
I think it was it was a strange comment. It probably would have been written 20 years ago. I don't know, but I think that it was from the point of view of the American threat, the threat to America. In other words, the threat was manageable on the eastern side. It wasn't going to spill across the Atlantic or spill into a nuclear. That's how I would take it, as a very subjective prism through American eyes, that they would say something that insensitive, because in actual fact, it is a threat, and he remains a threat. Although Ukraine has done a lot to degrade the military force of that, and the war has lasted longer than the Second World War did. So he has got a mediocre military that is flagging and failing and getting degraded by the day, and which is in turn degrading the Russian economy. So essentially, what Putin has done is he's wagering the Russian economy in this war, not the army anymore. He's going to throw everything at it.
Dan, we've spoken before about the global order, the development of this multipolar world. That already famous speech by the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that was made at Davos, urging us all to face today's reality, especially the middle powers. I just wonder what you thought of that speech and what your takeaways were, and whether or not what the vision that Mark Carney laid out there is possible to put into action.
Well, I don't know what he was doing. It was very imprudent to do it at a time when we're still in negotiations with the Americans for our free trade deal. He poked the bear on a global platform, and it was very embarrassing. So I thought that was poor leadership, frankly. Although the speech was, hey, good, somebody's saying something, but the idea that the little guys, the middles, can form some kind of a hegemon to counteract the hegemons is very naive. They don't get together on a lot of issues. So it was an interesting speech. It was controversial, but I don't think it's done Canada much good in dealing with the hegemon we have to deal with.
Eyes in this country, from London, have been very much on Beijing in the last few days because of our Prime Minister's visit there to Xi Jinping. How do you assess what is going on there, and what do you think of it in the context of the war in Ukraine and China's support of Russia's war machine through the components it supplies for its missiles and its drones?
Well, China is making a fortune because they're getting cheap oil from Russia. And as you say, they're supplying components, not outright weapons or ammunition or anything, but they're profiteering from it. I think what's interesting is the prime minister is doing what a lot are doing, and that is you have to deal with what I call the tripolar trade world. You have three gigantic economies: the European Union, the United States, and China. And you better be doing business with all of them to hedge your bets and to also be less dependent on one or the other solely. So he's doing that. I don't think a British prime minister has been in China for years. So that's kind of also that opens some other kind of doors diplomatically, I would think. That's what everybody's running around doing, trying to do trade deals.
You talk about opening doors diplomatically. Do you think Xi Jinping has any interest or has any leverage, if he wants to make Putin stop the war?
Not really. I don't think he would wade into that. That's not his turf. He doesn't have to get involved in that. He's not being affected. In fact, being enriched by it. And he's a little frightened of Russia because Russia has been militarily aggressive in his part of the world. Let's face it. Vietnam was a Russian deal. Korea was a Russian deal. And there was a war with Russia along the border. And there's a big border dispute between Russia and China involving Manchuria. So I think that he's probably happily content with the fact that Ukrainians are degrading the Russian military threat dramatically every day, day after day. And no, I don't see him wading into that. And he does need that cheap oil.
And just finally, Diane, we talked earlier about your friend who was forced to leave Kyiv because of the circumstances and what life is like there now. What are her intentions? Does she want to go back home? What's her future looking like?
Well, I think her trip to Poland was to get her children placed with relatives and take her kitty cats and her doggies there. She's going back. She's going back.
So you'll be in touch with her very soon, I hope.
Yes.
Diane, great to speak to you as ever. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome, Kate. Anytime.
Thank you for watching Frontline with me, Kate Chabot. For more on the war in Ukraine, please subscribe to this channel. And for the latest news and updates, you can also head over to the Times' YouTube channel. You can also read the latest on thetimes.com. And remember, if you want exclusive updates and content, sign up for a membership right here. For now, though, thanks for watching.